Lagos real estate and property sector, often described as a place where there is little logic but big returns. But in this city where landlords are the king, tenants groan under the burden of paying rent. The housing crisis in the state as a result of an expanding population has produced an unusual trend where renters here are left with no option but to pay their rent 2 to 3 years in advance. In many cases, the landlords routinely raise the rent as a result of the sharp rises in the cost of building materials.
The issues to do with the housing stock. There's a scarcity of housing in Lagos. Just the price of building homes. The price of doing business as developers, as people that want to invest in real estate and build a house for rent is huge. Also, the fact that there's no credit rating, no credit agency, there could be a very high rate of default if you take rent, a few months in advance. So landlords, in order to, to mitigate against that, will take 2 years or 3 years in advance. But I think mainly the issue for landlords is they've had to borrow at such high rates in order to build the premises.
In this upper-class neighborhood of Ikoyi, rent starts from 1 to 2 million naira per year, while in middle-class suburbs like Surulere, rent goes for 300,000 to 500,000 per year.
Prime residential markets, Ikoyi and Victoria Island, have always been high, mainly because they're high-income areas. The land is expensive. The type of properties you get are targeted to the expatriate market. Middle income, I would call parts of the mainland, the Lekki corridor. That market tends to be more, on the Lekki corridor, there are homes, there are flats, but I think an average of between 5 and 7. There we are starting to see a bit of a correction. Rents are coming down. There's a lot on the market, a lot of vacant properties. So I think the pressure there is starting to cause rents to come down slightly. Affordable homes, very difficult to say. You have face me, I face you, or a single room. That can range from anything. It's right across the board. I would say today it would range from maybe 60,000 for a room and parlor in, say, K2. To anything in Aja to about 80, 100,000.
This situation is so absurd that even employed workers like 26-year-old banker Uche Matthew, who earn good salaries, have no choice but to settle for less appealing housing because they cannot come up with 2 to 3 years rent in advance. Uche, who earns up to 1.2 million naira annually, stays in a bedsitter in city centre Surulere. Though his salary allows him to afford something bigger and better, he cannot come up with an advance of 2 years' rent in a nicer neighborhood.
I had wanted to settle for something more, what I felt was going to be kind of comfortable for me, a 2-bedroom flat, but it wasn't that easy too. But I finally got one which was quite affordable and it's quite expensive because understanding was to do a 3-year rent and I had to pay 300,000 naira annually, so for the 3 years was 900,000 naira, which was far off what I could afford. So I didn't want to lose the place because I needed a house. So what I did was to talk to some family members, some friends, and I met them. Some of them were kind enough, and I got some things and what I had from my savings, and I was able to make up that.
The idea of getting financing to live in such a neighborhood sounds almost ridiculous to him, as mortgage financing schemes are just not available.
I thought about that really because I work in the same institution. I know what it's like, and it's quite difficult with the whole revolution in the banking process. It's like walking to a bank and you're asking for a loan to get a house. All right, they see you hey, they're not sure you know what to do. All right, why do you want to ask for much as $1 million naira just to go rent a house for comfort? It's not as if it's a residential house. It's not as if you're going to use the house for business or whatever. Mortgages, it's not quite easy. What they do most time, they introduce you to friends they have kind of relationship with.
You shouldn't rent. You really shouldn't look for financing to rent. That should be out of your annual income. And in most economies, it's 40%, 50% of your annual income. But of course, in Nigeria, it's slightly skewed because you're having to pay years in advance, as well as huge sort of unregulated costs to agents and to lawyers for standardized documents. I think the lack of mortgage financing is the main problem with increasing the housing stock and for people's affordability of homes, whether it be rental or buying homes. Because if people were able to get mortgages, even just for investment properties, to be able to do a buy to lease, for instance, to buy something as an investment, get some financing and be able to rent it out to people, then I think rents will come down. But it's a very complex thing. There are lots of things that have caused rents to be so high.
However, there may be huge changes for workers like Uche in the coming years, as Lagos State House of Assembly is set to pass a bill to regulate rights and obligations under the tenancy agreement and the relationship between tenant and landlord. The state plans to enforce this bill by penalizing either landlord or tenant who receive or offer more than 3 months' rent in advance.
The bill, first and foremost, is an executive bill. It's an intervention by the executive, which thought it wise that the tenancy situation in the state was getting chaotic and that the state government ought to come in with some form of intervention measure. As the Judiciary Committee of the House, and indeed the whole House, when the bill came, we looked at it and we thought, usually at the second reading stage of any bill, that is when we discuss the general principles, what we consider merits and demerits. And we thought the bill had some merits, hence it was committed to a committee, and subsequently we've gone through public hearing to see the possibility of promulgating same into law.
The penalties will include jail time and considerable fines for those who break the law.
Well, in the opinion of the executive arm of government, they thought any landlord that receives as much as more than 3 months from a sit-in tenant ought to be penalized in some way. But again, that is the opinion of the executive. At the public hearing stage, we've had to take a lot of inputs. We've had those who are advocated for and against, and a lot of arguments. So it's all this we are going to synthesize and then come out with something that will be acceptable to the public.
Given the dismal housing situation, this bill is music to the ears of tenants like Uche, and the potential it has to turn things around in the sector is huge.
I think it's a good one. It's a good one, except that I think it's coming right out too late because it's not just now. Before now, there's been a lot of cries from people in Lagos, like too much, the house rent and all of that. But the good thing is that the government is beginning to start responding to that, and for me, I think it's like a way forward too.
I could understand why they would want to do that, because obviously it's ridiculous that people have to pay, that we all have to pay a year or 2 years rent in advance. However, I think it has to be more than a single-pronged approach. I worry about enforcement. How do you enforce, how do you make a landlord rent a property and accept 3 months in advance when there's a high risk of default? He cannot check the credit rating of the tenant. There's no clear way in which he can get the tenant out if he needed to. I guess if a landlord knew they could, there was a process in court where in 2 months they can get rid of a tenant and they can take some security up front, it might incentivize them to rent it out. But I think what you'll find is that landlords just won't rent. And it will be the tenants that will go to the landlord and say, I will pay you a year in advance, or I'll pay you 2 years in advance just in order to get the property. Landlords in Lagos State seem to be very resistant to change. And they're able to just take a lot of them are able to take a rent-free period until things get better.
But there is also skepticism that this law may never materialize after a similar law called the Rent Edict was introduced in 1997, but remained stagnant and was never implemented.